I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and Lazy Girl Designs, and welcome back to the Lazy Angle Basics series. We're currently working on the Rhapsody Quilt. This is the 5th video out of 6. If you haven't seen the previous ones, please be sure to watch them before you watch this one. In this video, we're going to take the blocks that we have cut out and pieced in the previous videos and put them together into a block. So now you should be at the point of having 9 units that are going to go together into a 9 patch. What that means is we're going to sew the top 3 together into a row, the middle 3 together into a row, the bottom 3, and then sew those rows together. But we want to keep in mind our intersections to make sure that we don't lose those points we've worked so hard to get. So when we head to the machine, the first one we're going to do is sew these 2 together, and we want to work on getting that to line up. And then the same thing here. And then when we go to sew this, naturally we usually fold our right piece on top of our left. But if we sew this way, we're not going to be able to tell what's happening with that point. So we're going to flip it over and sew from this side. So let's head on over to the machine and I'll show you how I start piecing together my block. The first 2 things we're going to piece together are the top left and the top center. So we're going to go ahead and place those right sides together. And rather than worry about the corners, I'm going to first focus on the center. And what I want is for this point to line up 1/4 of an inch down on that line. Now it's not directly centered between our dog ear. It's a little bit more to the right. If you need to go ahead and get a ruler to measure so that you can see exactly where it is, sometimes that helps in the beginning. Once you know exactly where you're trying to line it up, line the 2 pieces up and pin them in place. Now in a perfect world, things would line up in the corners, but as you see here, it doesn't. It looks like my flying geese block is a little bit larger than my lazy angle block, and things happen. So I'm going to go ahead and focus on this and sew the length of this seam. See how that turned out. That's pretty good. That looks good to me. And as you'll notice, things are not perfectly lined up here, and that's okay. We will compensate for that when we sew the rows together. So I'm not worried about that right now. I'm worried about getting my points to line up. My next 2 pieces that I'm going to piece together are my center left and my center. And as I mentioned over at my pressing station, I'm going to flip them right sides together, and then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to sew it from this side. And that way I can keep an eye on this point from my flying geese to make sure that I don't sew too far in and lose my point in my seam allowance. I'm going to line everything up, and it looks like these 2 are more on point size wise. And sew down this seam. And sometimes it can be helpful to use a stiletto to make sure nothing flips over. And now I have grabbed my bottom left and my bottom center, and I'm going to piece them in the same manner that I did my first 2. And it looks like these are a better match than the first 2. And sometimes things just happen and aren't perfect. And I like to show you that I am human too. And if these dog ears are bothering you, you can go ahead and trim them off. They don't bother me, so I leave them, but there's no harm in trimming them if they bother you. And so I am just going to slide this till I get it lined up where I want it to be, and then pin it in place. And you might be able to see here that my orange fabric definitely goes in, and you can see some of my pink underneath, and that's okay. I don't need everything to be perfect in my seam allowance. I just need my points to line up on the other side. So you can always kind of make accommodations for imperfections when piecing things. I'm gonna go nice and slow. Pull my pin out. See how that turned out. Pretty good. I could have gone a little more generous, it looks like, because my point is kind of floating in there a little bit, but I think it still works and it's good enough for me. But if that doesn't work for you, you can go ahead and touch that up. And then let's check our middle one. That looks great. So now I'm going to head on over to the iron to press these. Finger press that open. And remember, pressing is up and down. We are sewing straight of grain to straight of grain at this point, but we do have a lot of bias in our block, so we don't want to stretch things that we have worked hard to piece earlier in other steps. And when you have this much bulk, I do like to press from the one side and then from the other side. And if I wasn't recording, I would use steam, but I don't use that when I'm recording because it fogs up the camera. So I've got that one. And then if you haven't seen this before, this is my heat resistant stiletto, and this just helps me to make sure that I don't burn my fingers. Can keep this nice and close to the iron and the silicone end doesn't burn, and I don't have my fingers close. So now that I have those pieced, I always bring them back to make sure that I'm keeping everything in the right orientation. It's really easy if you to all of a sudden flip things and you go to put your block together and you're like, nope, that's not the way it was supposed to be. That's not how it was designed. So I always like to double check before sewing things in place. And so now it is time to sew this one to this one. We're going to do it in the same manner we did this. And then this to this, and we're going to do it with this on top again so that we don't lose our point. And then this to this, and again, we're going to sew with this one on top. I'll line those points up, pin, and sew with this piece on top. Going to go ahead and sew those in the same manner that I sewed the first three. I'm going to press these seams open just as I did with the other ones. Now that we have our 3 rows pieced, it's time to piece those together. We have a couple things we want to pay attention to. We want to pay attention to these points lining up, these seams, these points, as well as here. So there's a lot of things to pay attention to, so take your time. What we're going to start with is we're going to start with what I call thread pinning for these seams here. So I'm going to take you over to the machine and show you what that is. So what is thread pinning? Well, we're going to start with regular pins, and we're going to pin these things in place. And then we're going to go ahead and stitch just a small area. And we're basically going to use our thread as a pin. And if all is good, then we'll be able to continue to work on matching up our other points. If things are not good, we haven't sewn the full length of our seam, we've only sewn a small section, we can easily take it out, make any adjustments needed, fix things before we move on. So instead of sewing the length of this piece now, I'm just going to sew about 1/2 inch before and after each one of my 2 intersections that I've pinned. So let me show you what that looks like. So my first one, now I'm skipping everything else, coming all the way down here, and just sewing about a ½ inch before and after these points. Let's see how that looks. That one looks great. Let's check the other one. That one looks great as well. So now that we have those two taken care of, those are the two things we wanted to sew from this side. So now we're going to take the whole piece, flip it over, and we're going to pin here and here, and we're going to use our thread as a pin. And so we know if we sew the length of this seam directly on top of where the stitching already is, those points are going to be where we want them to be. We'll be able to keep track of this with pins, and we'll be able to keep track of this because we'll be able to see our needle when it gets close. So let's go ahead and line up our corners of our blocks where they come together. And put a pin in. And then here, this is that first one that I sewed that wasn't perfect. And so we want to make sure that we get to that 1/4 inch. So we don't want to sew way too far in here, but we also want to line up that. So we're just going to kind of split the difference and let it fall naturally where it wants to, which is this one a little bit past the line and this one a little under. And that's okay because it's all going to end up in our seam allowance. We're going to pin this in place. And then this is not matched to anything below. We just want to make sure that we don't lose that point. So we're going to start at this end. Just going to sew onto a scrap. I always like to begin on a scrap so that I don't get that thread nest. And we don't need a backstitch here because we'll be adding blocks to each other and a border to this quilt. So we're just going to begin up here. And we'll go slow until we get to that line that we already stitched. And so directly on top of the stitching that's already there. That's why I call it thread pinning. And then we're going to head for this next intersection. Make sure that none of my seams flip over. Make sure I pull my pin out before I get to it. You never want to sew over a pin. And now I'm sewing to this point. You can use a stiletto to keep that down if you need to. And I want to make sure my needle basically goes in right at the point of that flying geese. And if it goes in too far, I'm going to lose my point. And if it's too small of a seam allowance, then there's going to be extra orange there that is not a part of the design. So I want my needle as best as possible to go right in at the point. Now I'm going to sew from here to my other corners of my blocks. Again, make sure nothing flips. This is definitely a time to go nice and slow. There is no race. Much rather do it correctly than have to take it out. And slowly sew to my thread from the beginning. And we're almost done. Make it all the way to the end of the block. So let's see how all of that turned out. If we open this up, that one which we checked over there and this one which we checked over there look great. And that one is spot on. This looks good. This unfortunately must have shifted a little bit. So you can see that it is off by a little bit. It's under 1/8. That's the kind of thing that you have to decide personal preference. Does it bother you? If it does, what I would suggest is taking out from about here to about here so that you have enough space to adjust it. There's no need to take out the full length of the seam. So I'll show you what that looks like. Let's head back over to the machine and remove this section so that we can get that perfect. Gone ahead and opened up that seam. And I have found, for whatever reason, if I don't have success when sewing something this way, and I'm going to redo it, I often do it from the other side and then I have success. I don't know if that's just luck or chance or I can see things differently, but I'm going to give that a try here. So I'm going to line these up perfectly on top of each other, and there's enough give here to just kind of stretch it a little bit. And I want to do my thread pinning again so that I'm not having to take my stitches out along the whole length of this again if it doesn't line up this time. I'm going to get these as lined up as I can. Just sew a tiny bit of the seam to see if I have it lined up correctly this time. And there we go. It is spot on this time. So now I just need to go ahead and restitch the little pieces that I took out. And the reason I took out as much as I did is because I'm going to need to give a little pull and a tug here to make sure that everything lines up. So I'm going to start on my stitching that I had, about 1/2 inch, so that it overlaps. And I'm going to go straight to the stitching I just did. And all the way back, about another 1/2 inch on top. So now that is perfect. And like I said, it's personal preference whether or not something like that would bother you. If it's going to bother you in the finished quilt, take the time to fix it now. Definitely more frustrating to see it in a finished quilt and have it bother you. Now I'm going to go ahead and press this seam and then follow the same steps to add the 3rd row to this piece. As you can see here, I'm going ahead and doing the thread pinning. Going to stitch these areas. Check to make sure everything looks good. Then I'll go ahead and pin the corners. And sew the length of the seam. And now I'll press the seam just as I pressed the previous one. And just like that, you have pieced one large and very beautiful star. Half the blocks look like this, and the only difference with the other half of the blocks is instead of the lazy angle blocks in the corner, they have the corner flip with the triangle pointed out, which makes these even easier to piece. So when you go ahead and you're piecing your rows, you sew with this on top and you don't have to match it to anything. Your middle row is the same. Your bottom row is the same as your top. And then when sewing the 2 rows together, you don't need to worry about matching points here, but you do want to make sure that you don't lose those points. So what I suggest is to go ahead and pin the 2 rows together and make sure to use these landmarks and the ends. Then go ahead and do some thread pinning here, check and make sure everything's good, and then sew the length of the piece. Same for down here, and then you'll have your other star blocks made. In the final video, we'll talk about sewing our blocks together to complete the center of our quilt top. And then we'll talk about special things to think about when sewing our borders on to make sure they lie as flat as possible. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, leave your comments with us, and subscribe to the channel. If you've not yet signed up for the sew along emails, please do so at the link posted in the caption below. I'll see you soon.